So you guys don't want to bring up any of your Dogecoins or any other things that you're starting up, right?
Still in development. We'll give you a pick when it happens.
How about next month? Well, let's chat next month. We'll release a bonus episode.
Let's do an ICO.
2 sprints later.
Yeah. Hello. Welcome to episode 12 of the Metacast podcast. This is the podcast about podcasting. And today we have Ronak Nathani and Guang from the Software Misadventures podcast. In their podcast, Ronak and Guang bring in experienced folks from the tech world, and they discuss stories from their companies, problems, misadventures that they have had, as well as their career progression and topics like that. It's been one of my favorite podcasts over the last few years.
We didn't pay you to say that, so just wanted to clarify to the audience.
I wish I was paid. I mean, if you want to pay, I'll talk more about you.
It's too late. You already said it.
And with me here, we have Ilya.
Hey everyone, I'm a co-host of the Metacast podcast. Nice to have everybody here, guys. Because I can't say nice to see you. But yeah, welcome guys to our show. It's really a big honor to host you here. I discovered actually your podcast through Arnab because he's like, listen to these guys. They have a really cool vibe with jokes and all. And you will also have some amazing guests. Some of those guests, actually, I either heard their name, heard them talk, or even talked to them myself. So yeah, it's really great to have you here and learn from you, from your misadventures. We could have called our podcast the Podcasting Misadventures, and we could ask people about what went wrong with their podcast.
Yeah.
Hey, that would be a good name.
I like y'all's name.
I like Meta too, except we have to say on record that we're not affiliated with Meta.
Did that come from anything like someone complaining or?
No, we just joke around. I mean, if we get to a point where somebody's complaining about it, that would be nice, I think.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have.
Yeah. All right. Do you folks want to start with a quick intro of yourselves?
Hey guys, my name is Guang. Started my career in data engineering and then started slowly to go up the stack, so more into ML. And I met Ronak actually at one of the bootcamps that I did for data engineering, and then we've been friends since. These days, I'm doing a little bit of consulting and then trying to work on my own like small internet business ideas.
Yeah, folks, Ronak here, and thanks for having us, guys. I love the t-shirts that you have. We should probably do something like that.
We just got them, yeah.
Nice. So similar to Guang, I'm an electrical engineer by trade, but somehow got into software engineering. I always believed that, at least during my undergrad days, that I couldn't write code and I wasn't cut out for this field. Somehow I ended up here. Guang mentioned both of us met at Inside Data Engineering program. Guang, not a boot camp. We spent some time there, and that's where my love for infrastructure kind of grew. And I worked at Insight for a couple of years and then joined LinkedIn. And over the last 5 years, I've been working on compute infrastructure there, and these days leading our Kubernetes initiative.
So Arnab is also a civil engineer. It seems like I'm the only one with actually computer engineering training, but I'm the only one who doesn't work as an engineer.
Yeah, I'm a civil engineer by education, but I got tired of building bridges about 3 years into the 4-year course. And I was like, okay, I like software more.
You are still a real engineer.
Yes, I am.
I think that was a jab at me because I did operations research, which was called industrial. You can't see the air quotes, but industrial engineering, which the undergrads called it imaginary engineering. Can't really fault them.
So just a bit of, I think, backstory. Back when we started the podcast, or we were brainstorming starting the podcast in October, Ilya and I were like, okay, we got to get at least 10, 12 episodes scheduled in. So let's figure out who we want to invite. And I think, Ilya, you got like 4 or 5 people that you were listening to all the time. And I got 4 or 5 podcasters that I was listening to all the time. And we sent out invites to, or like reached out through Twitter and email and all that, whatever we could find. And this is back in October. So I first got a straight rejection, the first one. The second, the other 2 people didn't reply. Actually, the other 3 people didn't reply. And Ilya kept getting like, yes, I'm interested. And then eventually, I think in February, Ronak replied to it saying, hey, sorry, we didn't see the email. We would love to come on. And I was like, yes, finally.
Glad to be your first win, and sorry about the delayed response. We need to improve on that a little, or at least me particularly.
All good. We'll get into all that. So, do you want to talk a little bit about what the Software Misadventures podcast is? Why did you two decide to do the podcast together? Let's start with that.
This was, I think, summer of 2020, where everyone was starting a podcast and all of us had a little too much time at our hands. And actually, I've been a podcast listener for 8 years at this point. I think I first started listening to podcasts in about 2015, and I still love podcasts in general. And I was thinking about a podcast where we talk about technology a little more in depth than what I was getting at some of the other forums. So I reached out to Guang and at the time Austin as well. Three of us actually started the podcast together. And when we started discussing what the podcast should be about, at least the initial theme was, hey, let's talk about misadventures, because there is a lot that we learn when things don't go as planned. And that doesn't get talked about very often. And while this was the topic, the main motivations were there are enough people who are much smarter than us, have had different experiences than us, and in some cases, just have a lot more tenure. And we want to learn from them. One of the best avenues I've found to learn from people is through listening to podcasts. But at the same time, we wanted to be in a position where we could ask these questions and which are more specific to our own interests instead of questions someone else was asking. So it became kind of an excuse to get really cool people to talk to us. And people have been extremely kind to say yes and spend some time with us. One of the other reasons was we wanted to get better at asking questions. This is something that I've admired a lot in many podcasters that I listen to. I'll just throw out one name like Tim Ferriss. He's the one I've listened to the longest. And the quality of questions he asks, or I think Shane Parrish from the Knowledge Project. And there are a few others. And I love when these guys go deep into a specific topic or are able to pull insights out from the guest, because I don't think it's easy to give the guest enough room to express what they're thinking at the same time navigate the conversation. I've loved this art of asking good questions, and it's something that we wanted to get better at. And the third thing was, as we are having these conversations, we wanted to make sure that others could learn from what we were talking about. We want to be the dumb people in the room who can ask stupid questions and say, hey, this doesn't make sense. Please tell us more. I think many people feel that way. I mean, I'm not sure about you guys, but I've always felt weird raising my hand saying, hey, by the way, I got a question and this question is pretty dumb and I don't want to ask that in front of 100 people. But in this forum, we just wanted to be comfortable doing that. And as we were asking these questions, we want to make sure the conversations we were having were accessible to others too. Initially, it was more like, hey, let's just start a podcast. And I was thinking of starting it myself. And I was like, starting it with others would be a lot more fun. Like you guys are doing it together. And I love working with other people in general. And Guang and Austin and I, we've known each other for, well, at this point, 7 years, 8 years.
But Austin's dead to us after he left us. So maybe do 5-6 years.
Yeah. I reached out to these guys. I just pinged them. It's like, hey guys, thinking about this idea. What do you think? Somehow, I have no idea why. Both of them were very excited about doing this. So that's how we got started.
I'm curious, what was it like for you to get your first guests? Nobody knows you, right? Nobody knows about your podcast. Like, podcast doesn't even exist, right? What was the process of getting the first guest or maybe the first 3 guests?
When we decided to start the podcast, we actually didn't even have a name. We just knew what we wanted to talk about at the time and the kind of guests we wanted to bring on. We started indexing on the people that we had been following in tech for a while and wanted to reach out to them. And obviously, all the things that you said, the podcast did not exist. We didn't have a name, no website, but we decided to reach out anyway. So we reached out to 3 or 4 people, just describing what we wanted to do and if they would be interested in talking to us. I was in Boston at the time on vacation, and we were going from the airport to our Airbnb. And I got a response back from Kelsey Hightower.
Wow.
And I'm sitting in that car right next to my wife, like, holy crap. He's responded and he's saying yes. Now we got to figure it out. We scheduled it, I think, 6 weeks after we got the response. In those 6 weeks, figured out what the name should be, what the website should look like, what the logo should be. And that kind of acted as a motivator for us to get things done on time. There were some no's as well. Like we reached out to some people who said no. But at the same time, people have been very kind enough to respond, not as delayed as we responded to you. So sorry, guys. That's how we got our first guest.
Not everybody who listens to us is from the software world. So Kelsey Hightower is a big deal. So, let me just put it this way.
One of the many things I like about working with Ronak is the lack of shame. Did you reach out via Twitter or via email? I think it was Twitter, right?
I think I reached out via email. It took a little bit of searching to get to his email, but yeah, I reached out to his email. Twitter, too much traffic. Yeah.
I see. Because I was a huge fan of Kelsey Hightower for the longest time.
All of us.
Right. Exactly. So then first, I think when Ronak was like, yeah, I'm going to do that, I was like, yeah, right. That's going to happen. Maybe let's wait until 10 episodes. He was like, let's just try it now. Very good idea. It was a great episode because we were very new, right? We were just, hey, we don't know what the hell we're doing. But it really just started talking about really interesting stuff and we just had to chime in. It was a really nice experience.
I think it also set up your style of the podcast where you go deep into technical topics. In that first episode, I think you went to do lots of Kubernetes problems and things like that, but also talked about talking in front of a conference, in front of a lot of people, stuff like that. It was really good. And I think that set the tone for your podcast quite a bit too.
Yeah, for sure.
I wanted to ask a question about that because I listened to that episode actually this morning. So I have very fresh memories of that. There he talks quite a bit about how the big company wants you to be in that square box that HR wants to put you in with your skills and your capabilities, which is not always representative of what people want to do, of what people are capable of doing. And then he also talks about mentoring and how he really deeply loves and cares about people that he mentors, which was absolutely fascinating. But then in between these two topics, he talks about schedulers and HCD and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So my question is, obviously people who listen to your podcast, I suppose most of them are in the engineering field. But I would say maybe not everybody is interested in Kubernetes. So if somebody does mobile app development, Kubernetes to them is not as interesting, right? So I'm curious how you are thinking about, over the course of your podcast, how to balance those topics that are just universally appealing. You talk about career. Anybody can take advice from Kelsey on mentorship, but Kubernetes stuff is very specific. So some people would just be not interested. So how do you think about that? If you thought about it at all?
I think that's a great question. And exactly to your point, I think it's a spectrum. So on one end, you have podcasts like Software Engineering Daily, where at least how I used to listen to it is just look at the topic. If it's not interesting or I don't find it relevant, I'm going to skip. On the other hand, you have, I think, Tim Ferriss's example, right? Where it's just so generic such that you can read, just doesn't even matter what you're working on. There's always something that you can learn from. I think to your point, balancing that is super hard and it's a work in progress. We're still reviewing, trying to figure out who are the people that we want our listeners to be, and then to kind of tailor towards that. What we've been using is proxy of like using ourselves. If it's something that we find super interesting, then we're going to have them on. I think in terms of delving into the more technical stuff, as engineers or as people in tech, like product managers or something, usually even when you're on Hacker News just browsing, it could be something that's not exactly relevant to what you're doing. But if it's told or described in a way where I just find, it's so interesting. The point of the story is that I think it can be quite detailed, but still be engaging. So a lot of that depends on the delivery. But I do think that part of what we've been trying to narrow down is to find that framework. I think on one hand, you have too much detail. On the other hand, you have things are just too generic. But in the middle is sort of like these kind of frameworks that you can apply such that you can use that for other things as well.
Before recording the episodes, did you have a plan that we want to go into these areas for this guest, or do you just figure it out on the feel of the episode while recording what you want to venture into?
Every time we talk to a guest, we had an idea of what we wanted to dive into. In fact, when it comes to just choosing topics, as Guang said, one aspect is we don't make money from the podcast. That's not the intention. We want to continue doing it because we like it. And that's why our interests take the top priority. And in some cases, some episodes are not enjoyed by everyone. But as long as every episode has some people who really love it, that's good enough. And as long as we are having fun, I think that's good enough, at least for us right now. So in that case, like when we reach out to people, we reach out to them with a specific focus in mind that, okay, hey, this person's super interesting for various reasons. These are topics you would love to get into. So we have a high level idea of what you want to talk about. If we took Kelsey Hightower as an example, we knew we wanted to talk about career. We knew we wanted to talk about how he mentors people because he's mentoring people on Twitter, strangers he doesn't know. And he's awesome, by the way. And we also wanted to talk about Kubernetes because he played a huge role in making Kubernetes successful as it is today. We start with that outline and that's how we go.
And you're going to go talk about HCD and stuff.
Yeah. Or poetry.
Or poetry, yes.
Yeah. Again, we don't keep a rigid structure when it comes to talking to a guest. So it's like, here are the topics you're interested in, but something we learned through some episodes. So we don't care about going through each and every question that we thought about before. And we also don't care about the ordering, as we did at least in the first episode. I was like, let me just go through with this thing and finish it on time and not make a fool of myself. That was the goal, but at this point, we can just navigate around.
Yeah, that boat sailed, making the fool of ourselves.
It feels very similar to ours because we kind of do some research. And right now we have 3 pages of things to talk about, but we don't know how much of that we'll get into. But it depends on the feel of the recording. Like right now, we'll venture into some of these and go deeper maybe in some areas. I think the one important thing for podcasters is to have enough things written up beforehand to be able to venture, because some topics you bring up and it abruptly ends, or yeah, I did that, fine, done, let's move on, right? So you got to have like enough research done so you have lots of things to talk about in the episode. So while talking about that, you did have 3 people in the podcast in the beginning. And we were wondering how, because with Ilya and me, we are always stepping on each other's toes sometimes in the podcast, or sometimes somebody's forgetting to introduce the other person and things like that.
Oh, I wonder when that happened.
So we have a lot of passive aggression going on. Unintentionally.
Yeah. With 3 people, that's got to be even more, right? Especially with a guest. You always had one guest at max, but let's say you have 2 people coming in. How did you manage all that?
Poking where it hurts. I like it. I thought you were going to ask, why did the other person leave? But okay, I see. We're taking the nicer route. Actually, Austin, the other guy, is my best friend. So we're all on very good terms. I think y'all's relationship is a bit similar, right? So like, I'm usually for comic relief, and Ronak asks the serious, the good, very thoughtful questions. And I just make my dumb jokes to keep things light. It works out really well. Is that what we're talking about in terms of the conversation itself? We're talking about prep and how do you divvy up the work and stuff.
In the conversation itself, I was wondering, like, if you have specific things that you yourself are interested, like Guang, let's say, I want to talk about this, or Ronak, you say, I want to talk about this, or do you just write everything up and get the feel for the podcast and just go?
So I really like working with Ronak because we have similar interests, general interests, but at the specific stuff, I think it's pretty different. His background is a lot more infrastructure, is more lower in the stack, versus mine is higher. So ML application, I'm really interested in indie hacking, things like that. So I think that makes it a very natural split in terms of when we do ask someone who has experiences in different buckets. So that categorization becomes very obvious to us.
Yeah. One thing which I would add to that is if we took an example of an episode, for instance, when we're prepping, we usually write down topics. At one point, we would write down the exact questions too. Not that we would read it out, but it helps us formulate our thought in the head before the conversation itself. So what we used to do is we would split out sections, and one would be a lead, the other person would assist. So in that case, what happens is it's the responsibility of one person to drive that section forward, and the other person can ask follow-up questions if needed, for example. So that allowed us to not step on each other's toes. That was one thing that we tried. We have tried a different version of that sense where there are no sections split up that way, but there are high-level ideas split up that way. So it's still like, okay, this topic is something that Guang would cover, this topic is something that I would cover, but there is no sequence at that point. So what happens is when we are talking about it and when the other person feels, hey, this is a good time to introduce this subject, that person would jump in, take the conversation there. But then one person is still responsible to make sure we go through the conversation, bring it to a close, don't go off on tangents way too much. Think of it this way. One person's responsibility is to make sure you start at the source, reach the destination. The second person can take you on detours and whatnot, but it's that first person's responsibility to make sure you move forward.
We have a name for this. We have been trying to do checklists since episode 1, but we failed to do that until episode 10, I think, because we just get too excited and then we would go on all sorts of tangents. Once we recorded an entire episode where we didn't talk about podcasting at all because we just got so excited about sci-fi.
Must be a fun episode.
So yeah, we had to release it as a bonus episode.
And I think there was one episode where the guest did not say their names all through.
Yeah, it was funny. So yeah, we introduced a concept of check police, check as in Czech Republic, but it's also as in checklist. So today Arnab is responsible for making sure that we stay on track.
Let's move on to the next topic then.
Hey, you're doing a good job.
So I've been listening to your podcast. As soon as they come in, yours, the Indie Hacker, and Scott Henselman's that podcast, those are the 3. Like, as soon as an episode drops, I listen to it.
These are the ones that told you no, right?
Yes.
I love the Indie Hackers podcast. I think it's amazing.
Honestly, it's an honor to be named next to Indie Hackers and Scott Hanselman's podcast. So thank you. Means a lot.
Right, yeah. We have our own favorite episodes and moments from your podcast. We're going to talk about that. But before we get there, I want to hear what are your favorite episodes? What were like some of those surprising or memorable moments that you have?
For me, it's very obvious. Michael Lynch, he was also on Indie Hackers. Dude's fucking amazing. He's just such a wholesome guy. Like, I want to be his friend. He's very transparent, right? Sorry. So for context, he quit Google, I think maybe 5-6 years ago. So he was there for like a couple years. And then he left to indie hacking. And I love how he thought about it because he set a budget being like, I'm going to try to do this for 3 or 5 years. And then if I can't make it, I'm going to come back and do something else. So then he just posts these monthly retrospectives. What did I do this month? What project am I working on? Super transparent. And just reading through it is like taking you on like a journey of all the things, all the ups and downs. Because for the first 2 years, he made negative profit, negative money. But the third year, the business really started to take off. And it was a very surprising enterprise that came out of that as well. So I think the subject, the guy, just amazing. And I think he had pretty funny stories at the end.
It's not surprising. That was my most favorite episode too. In fact, I heard that episode and then I found more about Michael. He was also on the Indie Hacker podcast at a different time. So I went and listened to that episode. So last year, backstory, I was working as a principal engineer in AWS, but I had this itch kind of going on. Like I'm in too many meetings and I'm not doing enough. I love building things and I was not building enough anymore. So that was already going on. But your episode, and I think there was one from Indie Hacker as well, the Daniel Vassallo episode. He was an engineer in AWS, maybe in 2019 or something. Those two episodes inspired me that what am I waiting for, right? So I immediately went on a leave of absence in June last year, took 3 months, hiked around, and figured, okay, I'm just going to take the leave. And I left my job. And then I think I actually seriously started working on stuff in January, but it's been amazing so far. So thanks for that bit of inspiration. That was my top episode too.
Damn, that's so cool.
That is pretty awesome, by the way. It takes courage to do that. It's not easy.
Courage and finances too, I think.
Of course.
One thing that I really like, the quote from Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He is a philosopher and a trader. He wrote Black Swan and Anti-Fragile and a few other books. I think he said something like that the worst addictive thing in the world is the monthly paycheck or something like that. It basically makes you hooked onto that salary that you get every month and you just become complacent and stop taking risks and actually start doing things to avoid taking the risks. That's where complacency is bred.
Okay, so Ronak, now you have had enough time to think over, I think.
Sure. So in general, answering questions about what's your favorite X, it's always very hard for me. People will ask questions about what's your favorite food, what's your favorite place and whatnot. And I always struggle with that question because it's hard to pick one.
So before you get to that, what's your favorite food?
Place.
How much time do we got here?
We're going to be here for a while.
I mean, I love food, by the way, and I can go on talk about food. I don't think your audience would be interested in listening to all my weird food habits. But in terms of episodes, again, all of our episodes were very different. We learned something different from each one of them. The ones that just come to memory right now, Kelsey's episode, since that was actually the second one we recorded, but the first one we released. The reason we recorded that second was we recorded one with Ryan Underwood, who was my colleague at LinkedIn, and I felt a lot more safer with recording it with him our first time and making all the mistakes. But he was super kind this time. So Kelsey's episode, we were essentially starstruck and wanted to just get it going, but it came out to be a really good episode, much better than what we had thought. The other one was with David Henke. I've been at LinkedIn for about 5+ years at this point, and David Henke was at LinkedIn. He was the SVP of engineering at some point where he led the reliability engineering org. And he has tons of stories about LinkedIn from the days past, at least before my time. And he is an amazing storyteller. If someone needs to know how to tell a story about tech, I think he's one of the really good ones. There are a couple other episodes which was very hard to expect what it would turn out to be, but we were super interested in the topic. One was with Ashwin Kumar. He's a close friend with Guang, and we talked to him about hackathons and pitching product ideas, which was very different from everything else we did, but the conversation was super fun. The last one that comes to mind is the one we had with Kailash Nath. He is the CTO of Zerodha. Zerodha is the stock trading company back in India. His episode took a very different turn than what we had thought. We talked about absurdism or Being an absurdist, we talked about philosophy for 20 minutes. We talked about how they run Zerodha as a company with like 30 plus engineers running the largest stockbroker in India and stockbroker probably in the world by volume. That was a very fun episode too.
By the way, we just lost Guang. He either got tired of talking to us or maybe had some internet trouble because his picture was getting pixelated before too.
It's his internet. I'm just going to ping him. This is usual with Guang.
Has this happened while recording?
More than once. More than once. Yes. I don't know if he minds, but I'll share it anyway. So he's been traveling around the world. He did this 3-4 years back where he took 12 months off, traveled around the world, and liked it so much, came back, worked as a machine learning engineer, and decided to do it again. And I think right now he's in Mexico. Yeah, he's in Mexico City right now. And when he's traveling, he's living in Airbnbs or hotels. So at many times, either the internet is spotty or there is some construction going on, and otherwise some neighbor is screaming somewhere and making loud cooking noises or whatnot. So we've dealt with pretty much all of those at some point.
He was talking to us just before we started recording about that. It's fun, yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned this Starstruck when you interviewed Kelsey Hightower. I remember first time talking to him because we were part of the same org at Google, working on Kubernetes, and I was in a group meeting with him, and he was saying some good ideas, and I just pinged him on our internal chat. I'm like, Kelsey, like, can we talk? And he's like, yeah, sure. How about today at 4 p.m. or something? And I'm like, oh my God, Kelsey Hightower is talking to me. And for the first few minutes, I'm like, oh my God, what if I ask dumb questions and stuff like this? But he was just so nice to me, and I guess to everybody who he talks to. We had a bit of that experience, I think. Our very first guest on our show was Brian McCullum, who is the host of the Internet History podcast, which was the podcast that hooked me on the listening to podcasts in the first place. I listened to maybe hundreds of his episodes, and I just love it so much. He's like a TED speaker, and he was the first person to say yes. And we were just like, oh my God. The interesting thing he said in the episode, though, is we asked him, why actually did he agree to talk to us? We are nobody in the podcasting space. And he just said that, I know what it's like to get started. I just said yes, because if nobody says yes, how are you going to get started? So I just wanted to be nice to you. And it came out a great episode and all. I'm not surprised to hear that people actually said yes to you, because you guys send the right energy and people react to that.
Oh, yeah, it's incredible.
It's been wonderful in how people are willing to help. Once you're ready to open up and ask, how easy it is to get people to help you out. It's been amazing.
For sure. People are super nice.
I do think even the cold email that you guys sent to us, I assume you did similar, Ilya, right, for the other guy. I think it was a great email.
Oh, yes.
You talked about sort of the why. It just felt very personalized, right? Because we get also spammy emails. I was surprised by how many people reach out either to place someone on your podcast or business stuff. So it's really refreshing to read a nice email from someone who's also in the trenches.
There's actually a subreddit and a service right now, I think called Podcast Guest Exchange or something like that, where you can put in like, I'm the host of this podcast and you invite me to other podcasts and what you're going to charge and all that. We were like, okay, we're not doing all that. Let's just send out personal notes about why we listen to their podcast and all that. Yeah.
I forgot which podcast it was. I think it was by a guy who has a YouTube channel in Belarus. And he was talking about how he never takes money for people kind of being on the show, because he did it once. And there was this weird guy. It was a fine discussion up until the point where he started to promote his stuff, which ended up being some kind of scam. And I think he eventually had to take down the episode, and people were like bitching to him, why did you interview this guy? Like, he took all of my money. So yeah.
Ouch. That's rough. That's rough.
He was like, oh, and never do it again. So we only reach out to people who we know.
So you guys don't want to bring up any of your Dogecoins or any other things that you're starting up, right?
Still in development. We'll give you a pick when it happens.
How about next month? Well, let's chat next month. We'll release a bonus episode.
Let's do an ICO.
Do sprints late.
Yeah.
I was driving today and I was looking at your logo, which has always this line and triangular thing.
It's a mountain with the eye.
Oh no, you thought he was... Oh no, you think it's a mountain. Oh no.
No. My first thought when I saw it was that this is a regular expression.
Regular expression. Okay. Okay.
Oh, no.
Wait. Why regular?
It's like M or S inside that.
So Arnav overthinks stuff, you know.
Hey, Ronak, who was the fabulous artist which we paid good money to commission this piece of art?
It was our dear friend Austin Wu Young. We're thinking about how should we represent misadventures, And because it's about tech, we introduced the curly braces. And Austin works on the monitoring infrastructure team at LinkedIn, and he's been on that team for a couple of years now. And he's like, "Hey, how about a graph that has a blip? Because like that's when that
okay.
indicates things are not going as expected. So let's just put a blip there with an eye." I'm like, "Yeah, works. Let's do it."
I like it. It's a very catchy logo, actually.
You're very kind, Arnab. You're very kind.
Too late, sir. Too late. You already said he looks like a mountain or a regular expression.
Yeah.
For me, that blip is, like you watch a movie when somebody is dying on a hospital bed
Oh, yeah.
and they have this flat line and then they get kind of reanimated and you get the blip, their heart starts to beat. That was my first association when I saw that.
That's fascinating.
I think someone else told us this. I forget, was it Catherine, Austin's wife, or Aishani, who's my wife? Either of them told us, hey, this might be misinterpreted with someone's heartbeat and someone at the hospital, for example.
Yeah.
And we were like, it's okay.
In a way, that's what it is, right? It's a critical thing in your software world that kind of a blip is a problem.
Open to interpretation.
Yep.
Guang, while you were absent from this conversation, we talked a bit about you and your travels.
Electricity went out. The building's electricity went out. You can't make this up. That's crazy.
I was just talking about your travels. And just this morning, I actually read news about Amazon forcing everybody back into the office and how there was a huge backlash because people bought houses, moved their kids, whatever, because they expected this to last. Well, the companies made policies, right, that you could work indefinitely from anywhere. I mean, I moved to Florida for one, from Seattle, even though most of my team is in Seattle in California. I'm just curious what you guys' take on the remote work and how that maybe liberated you, or on the contrary, I don't know, made you feel worse. Like that work from home topic, I think, is what I want to talk about a little bit.
That's actually one of my goals this year, is to figure out where longer terms, 2 to 5 years, where do I want to be based off of? I think exactly what you're alluding to, right? You have so much possibility. And for me, before, I think I thought always the proximity to people, like to friends, to family, is super important. But then COVID made me realize, like, oh shit, like you have to be very intentional about it. Honestly, the podcast is also a nice way to catch up with Ronak as well, just like maintaining that friendship. Obviously, it's better still to have friends and stuff in real life. Also be difficult if you have a girlfriend, right? But I do think that there's large possibilities. For me, I realize my priorities are the food has to be really good, hopefully a lot of Asian options, which makes a lot of places in Latin America difficult. And I really got into dancing bachata. It's a type of Latin dance, which then makes Asia kind of difficult because I don't think it's that popular in Asia. And then also the third is like somewhere cheap, right? Because I want to kind of work on like different small internet business ideas. So then I want to reduce my burn as I'm trying to figure it out. Because I know that it's going to, thanks to Michael Lynch, kind of showing the way of like, it's going to be pretty painful, I think, the first 2 years, especially if you're not going the VC route, right? That kind of rules out like US. So for me right now, I think the top 2 choices, so Mexico City, I think has been great. There's also a lot of expats, so it's also easier to make friends with more similar experiences. And then I'm thinking about checking out Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, because I think it's also a very big city. It's very diverse. They speak English very well as Chinese, which I speak. And then the food is really good. So.
And you're not planning to go to Portugal? I think people in the indie hacker community would know what I'm talking about, but...
Yeah. No, it got super popular. And then now there's a backlash, right? Because they got rid of the digital nomad visa and things. The other thing that I thought was important to me is to be able to at least sort of speak the local language. So then Spanish for me was like something I'm trying to learn. But then Portuguese, man, just like, oh man, if you go to Brazil, the accent is so different. So I just thought, I'm not going to spend all that effort trying to pick up Portuguese. So for me, I think that was the reason. Have you guys thought about going to different places other than Canada and the States?
I just moved last summer, but we did want to go back to Russia in a couple of years. But after the whole Ukraine situation, it's like off the tables. Basically, last year, we've been readjusting our expectations and just figuring out that you can't predict what's going to happen tomorrow. So it's best to enjoy today. Planning for the future became not a thing anymore.
We moved from Seattle to Vancouver about 4 years ago now. So I have a daughter, she's 11, and a dog. He's actually right behind me. So she made lots of good friends, and also it's not going to be easy to like just uproot all. We did it already once to her, and we don't want to do that again. But we do like to go to new places. Like you, I love Mexico. I'm picking up Spanish quite a lot too. And I think it would be nice to be able to spend the dry season there or somewhere else, traveling around the world. But that's still at least 10 years down the line, I think. For now, last year we spent a month in Banff. My wife was working from there. I was basically hiking with my dog and my daughter the whole time. It was fabulous.
Sounds incredible. Yeah, Banff is on
Yeah.
my list.
There's good climbing there as well, right? Do you climb by chance?
I don't climb much, not like technical ones, but the hardest ones I did were rope climbing, where there's already somebody has laid out a rope or ladders are there. But yeah, it was beautiful. My definition of hard hikes became different after that. So yeah. Yeah.
And Ronak, you've been doing remote work since you got to Canada, right? How has that been like?
Yeah. It's partly remote work or work from home that actually made it much easier for me to move to Canada while still continuing with my team. Before COVID, there was no company-wide remote work policy. It was more of a case-by-case thing. And there were some people who worked remotely, but that was done as an exception more than a norm. And we had already decided before COVID that we would move to Canada at some point. And I didn't know at the time whether I would be able to continue with LinkedIn or not in my current job. But with COVID, again, work from remote policy became an easy thing. The transfer was pretty straightforward. And because we had been working from home anyway, like even in the Bay Area, moving here was mostly adjusting to the time difference, nothing other than that. But on the whole work from home thing, I like hybrid instead of one or the other, honestly. There are days when I love just being at home and being able to focus. So either I have a lot of back-to-back meetings, or if I need a lot of focus time, I love being at home. But then there are times when you're not physically in the same room with people. Let's say you want to brainstorm something or discuss something and you're missing that whiteboard. I mean, I've tried, I don't know how many different apps to whiteboard over a Zoom call or a Teams call. It's not the same. And the biggest difference I found over the last couple of years was when you go back after a long weekend or a break, you go back to a call and you're right to business. And the biggest difference when you're at work was you go to your seat and people just talk about, hey, how was your weekend? What did you do there? So LinkedIn has an office in Toronto, so I go here as well, even though there are not many engineers here or no one from my team. That interaction, which is more informal and not about just work, I don't see that organic over a call. So I definitely miss meeting people in person a little more. But I think that's preference more than anything else.
So do you travel to the Bay Area once in a while?
I would if I had my visa.
Okay.
My work visa was cancelled after I moved to Canada. And my visitor visa, I've applied for it, except there are no appointments available.
Oh, yeah, I know that story.
Yeah, exactly. So my appointment is like next year in January.
Jesus.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
I also just applied for a B1 visa and I got next year, April. But I kept looking. If you keep looking, there are spots opening up. So I actually got it this April.
Oh, wow.
Within like a week or so. Yeah.
Okay.
So keep looking.
I should do that. Thanks for the tip.
Yeah. Talking about moving to Canada, I think my story was very similar actually. We wanted to move to Canada. And at that time, so Ilya and I have been peers working together. I think for a year or two, you were my manager too, right? So when we decided that we want to move to Canada, you were my manager. I don't know if you remember or not. And this is before COVID. And these policies were not there, right? You can't just go to a different country and report to a manager from a different country because of tax and financial things and all that. But somehow Ilya was able to convince people to let me do that. And so that's how I moved. That was awesome. Yeah.
There's a lesson in like anything is possible as long as you know the right people
Oh, yes.
and can tell a story.
Yeah.
Ronak, you're a senior staff engineer at LinkedIn, and you've been working at like big companies, LinkedIn, for a while now. How do you enjoy that part? Flipping that on Guang, I think you're starting to explore the indie hacker and you prefer working in startups and small companies. I want to hear from both of you. What do you like? What do you not like?
I first worked at Insight, which was a startup. I was, I think, 18th or 19th employee at the company. And I was pleasantly surprised how much trust they put in me, who had not done anything before from a professional standpoint, except for going to school and doing side projects. It's like, hey, by the way, do you want to run this program for us? I'm like, whoa, you trust me to do this? Okay. So the amount of things that I learned over 2 years at Insight was, in terms of density of learning, I have not experienced that anywhere else. And it wasn't just technical stuff, it was everything else. Learning how to communicate to people at all different levels. How can you go from deep technical issues to abstract it out at the high level and talk about strategy? How can you talk about business development, talk about leaders at other companies about sales, for instance, because we were still trying to sell a product. Being able to do that at a startup was amazing for me. Just getting that autonomy. I knew that I enjoyed autonomy and I don't like being micromanaged. If I need to do something, give me a task and trust me that I can do that. And you can always check in to see if it's on track. And from there, I reached a point where it felt like I wasn't growing as much or learning as much. So I decided to make that move. I explored a few options and landed at LinkedIn. At LinkedIn, it was very different as compared to a startup. As you said, it's a big company. So things are a lot more structured. You're not working on very wide things like, I'm not going to do sales for LinkedIn ever. I'm not going to talk about business development. I would do that at a startup. That allowed me to go much deeper into the infrastructure layer. At the same time, all the learnings I got from working at a startup helped me in many other areas at LinkedIn. If I'm pitching an idea, for example, how do you go about even thinking about it? Like, why should you do this? So thinking about business metrics, thinking about how it's effective to the company, that all came very organically instead of just talking about engineering pipelines. I've been there a while, as you said. I hit a point every year where I think about, am I learning? Am I growing? Am I having fun? And if these things are not true, then what's the point? And so far, I've had the opportunity to work on different things at LinkedIn, and all of those things have kept me very engaged. These three things still continue to be true. One thing which I'll also say is that LinkedIn as a company cares a lot about people, and it shows up in culture as well. It challenges you in various ways. At the same time, it recognizes when you need to set your own pace when times are difficult. And people in general are pretty awesome. And I think that makes all of this worthwhile.
Nice. Guang, you want to give us your take on this?
Not nearly as smooth as how Ronak put it. Have you guys heard of the thing, like for your career, it's 3 things that are important, and then you figure out your own priority? It's like purpose, craftsmanship or mastery, and then autonomy. I haven't thought about this until maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, and then it makes sense. Like for me, autonomy, I think, is the most important thing. So then I've only worked at startups. The first one was like employee 3. The second one, there's only 60 people, 70 people. And the last wave was like 3 people, I think. I really like the fact that you can explore like different roles, what Ronak was saying. I think it's kind of funny. Before I was like, wow, they trust you to do this super important task without any experience. And then you kind of realize it's not that they trust you. It's like they don't really have a choice.
There's nobody else.
There's no other option.
So I think it's something to keep in mind, but I do think that it really does give you a lot of opportunities. The thing is that you have to be very intentional about it. It's very, like, you don't want to just cruise. You make far less money, and right, there's far less certainty in terms of the future, as well as like, if you want to get a new role. So for the last 2 jobs, I think going into it, I got a lot more disciplined about like, hey, this is what I envision where the company is going to be and where I'm going to be in 1 year. And then in 1 year, let's revisit, right? What might happen is, you're like 80% off from what you were expecting. And then it's kind of like, okay, shit, clearly something's not working out. Maybe it's time to move on.
I think that's a great framework, yeah. Especially in a startup, because the startup is moving so fast. I think for you to set up your own expectation of what you will be doing and what the startup would be doing in a year or 2-year horizon. I love that, yeah. Maybe we should start moving towards the actual podcasting logistics and mechanisms and all those kind of things.
Yeah, let's actually go back to the topic that we brought up before we start recording. So what microphones and gear do you guys use?
I use the Shure SM58. This also came from a recommendation. I think I was listening to Tim Ferriss' show and I looked at what gear he uses and he was like, this thing you can throw on the floor and it'll be fine. I was like, I'm going to go for that.
Have you thrown it?
Not that I throw my microphone on the floor. There are way too many options. I didn't have to think about which one to pick from. I tried this one, and the other one I tried was Audio Technica. Forget the exact model. It's about $100 USD. The nice thing it has is that it plugs into a USB. What I found was that mic was a little too sensitive for my taste. So I tested out this one and the other one. This one, I felt the audio quality, I liked a little better than the other one. So I just went with it. In hindsight, should have gone with something that gives you a USB plug. So you don't need to go around with this Focusrite interface with an XLR cable.
So you've got the Focusrite Solo.
Yes, I've got the Focusrite Solo.
Just for the record, I got the Focusrite 2. Mine is I think it's 2i2. It's basically the same as yours, but it has 2 ports instead of 1
Yeah.
port.
Yeah.
Because I also play the guitar and I can plug the guitar into the second port.
Oh, that's pretty sweet.
Ilya is like a nerd when it comes to sound. So.
I wish I could play the guitar.
And he got me to buy this Blue Yeti thing, which I also feel like it's too sensitive. But once actually we start making some money, maybe I'll get a Shure MV7 or
I think that's Shure SM72. Which one are you using, Ilya?
SM7B. I'm using the Shure MV7, which is a younger sibling of the V microphone, the Shure SM7B. But this one has a USB connection too, but it can also be plugged into XLR. In retrospect, I should have just bought an SM7B.
7B is nice. I didn't use it, but I think Joe Rogan uses that one. Lex Friedman uses that one. Kelsey Hightower had that one as well.
Oh my gosh, Kelsey Hightower setup so good. The camera, like the webcam, was ultra HD, and then it just looks like, whoa, so cool.
Do you have video from that episode?
Funny story. We were actually using Squadcast at the time. We moved away from Squadcast to Riverside because on Squadcast, we lost our recording a couple of times. So, for example, if someone's internet connection got lost, that person would drop off and the recording would stop if any guest drops off. And that was annoying because at times we wouldn't notice. Like if a guest is talking, recording stops. Well, you lost the part that they said. And it's weird to go back and ask them to, hey, can you do that again? Like if they're in the flow, it's not natural.
When was that?
This was, I think, late December 2020 and the first half of 2021. This is when it was. And I'm sure they've improved their reliability quite a bit, but it wasn't fun back then.
To be fair to Squadcast, I think part of it was also our mistake where they put the recording button or like the indicator. I think it was at the bottom and then it wasn't very obvious versus now it's like very highlighted. So part of it was our fault. Basically when someone dropped off, like so we stopped, but then we didn't re-click the thing. But to Ronak's point though, like now it's doing what it's supposed to do, right? Which is recording throughout. Doesn't matter when someone drops or not.
But just to come back to your question about Kelsey's episode in the video. So that happened in that episode. We didn't have the recording on Squadcast for about like 20 minutes. And the nice thing was that we were recording locally and he was also recording locally. So we got all the tracks and mixed it up.
Wait, so you were recording locally separate from Squadcast? Oh, interesting.
That's what SREs do.
It's like 1 is none, 2 is 1. We always, well, not always, but many times we had Auphonic running on the background and, not Auphonic, sorry, Audacity running in the background. And yeah, we would all have a local recording.
It was something I never thought of, but then Ronak was like, oh, just in case we should ask the guest to, do that. I was like, oh man, that sounds like such a hassle. But then second episode, of course it happened. So thanks, Ronak.
For the record, our episode number 8 is with Squadcast founders. So it actually came out this week, the week that we are recording this episode. So it came out in, I think, February 28th or March 1st.
Well, it's good we're saying this after you recorded with them.
Yeah. No, I've been using Squadcast for pretty much every single episode except one. And also I've been using for my other podcast. The issues you have experienced, I can't tell they don't exist anymore, but we have not experienced them.
In the episode, they did talk about some of those early challenges. And I think during COVID, their usage kind of skyrocketed, right? And they found a lot of problems. So I think they've learned from that and fixed a lot of things.
Yeah, I feel like we're defending Squadcast a lot. But yeah, we love Squadcast.
Are y'all getting that sweet Squadcast sponsorship money?
They don't pay us too. Sad.
So Guang, what microphone do you use?
I just have this very hilariously tiny Samsung Go. So SAMSONGO. Doesn't have any model numbers as far as I can tell, unlike your fancy microphones. I just Google what's the smallest form factor because I travel quite a bit. I think Blue Yeti has like a Snowball or something that's quite small, but this thing comparing to that is like hilariously small. So if when you hear this episode, if it sounds like ass, then maybe this is a bad choice. But I think it sounds great, and I think for traveling, it's like a really good choice.
We pay to a sound engineer to produce our podcasts. So I think you'll be surprised how nice you will sound. Sometimes I get surprised, it's like how great this is.
Wow, we would request that contact from you, by the way.
Yeah, happy to share.
How did you guys find an audio engineer? Do you have to like interview and stuff for it, or is it a previous contact?
I worked with him on my Russian podcast. Basically, what got me into podcasting. So somebody invited me to a podcast in Russian in 2020. So I went there, I talked to the guy. I'm like, okay, it's actually great thing. I want to do a podcast too. I asked him like who he used as a sound engineer. So it's all nepotism, like knowing the right people.
Excellent.
Nice.
But yeah, I'm happy to do the intro.
What's your other podcast about?
One podcast which is kind of dormant. It's about technology, more like career in technology. So I invited people who work in different companies like Amazon, Google, whatever, and we'll talk about their experience. And then the other one that I started in January this year, but I already have 29 episodes. I would just turn on my microphone like every now and then in the evening and just talk for 10, 15, 20 minutes. And then I published without even listening back to it. It's also in Russian, but sometimes I will talk about career. Sometimes I will talk about something that happened to me, like cops stopped me or something. Basic stuff, you know. I was in a spiritual retreat in Peru and I was talking about that, which got quite good reception because I was pretty transparent. I call it the audio blog. So it's like a journal. And it resonates with some people because it's across different topics, you know. It's surprising just how easy it is to publish podcasts these days. I did this one on Substack. Like Arnab was saying, I know the sound stuff. So I have this kind of setup where I can actually go turn on the mic, record, render the file, and just publish it. So it's actually post-produced. I just don't have to do it every single time because I have this template. So I'm curious, actually, how do you post-produce your episodes? And also, where do you host the podcast?
Blood and sweat is what it takes. We post-produce our episodes ourselves. We use Audacity. Everything is a monotrack. We combine it together, clean it out. Again, both of us edit, but the process might be different for both of us.
Mine's shittier.
Process I go through is like listen to the entire episode, find out the things that are definitely not good and I need to clean it up. We rarely cut things out, but what we clean up is like or background noise at times, or if like the mic volume is too low for someone. After all of this is done, add the intro, outro, and then we usually run it through Auphonic. If you haven't tried that, I mean, you have a sound engineer, so you're good. But otherwise, any audio, like it doesn't matter how much we equalize it on Audacity, sending it through Auphonic just brings it to another level. So that's what it looks like. And we host it on Libsyn.
How long does it take you to produce one episode?
Too damn long.
Yeah. Okay.
Too long.
This is the story of every podcaster everywhere, I think.
I would say anywhere between 4 to 6 hours, like from editing to publishing.
For like how long? Like 1.5 hours, 1 hour of content?
Yeah, 60 to 90 minutes.
Yeah, one thing I'm trying now is actually just this morning I was talking to my wife's sister, who is currently a student. She's studying English language back in Russia. What we're trying to do is I showed her how to use Descript. So she could remove all of those ums and ums and repeated words, all this basic stuff. Basically, the first pass of the content, because it was taking me too long. And then after that, we would send it to the sound engineer. His job would be primarily to just make sure that the equalizers are all good, like breaths are removed, all the technical stuff. So she would be more like doing the content, and he would be doing the technical audio bits. Let's see how that works.
That's really fun. Keep us posted. Yeah.
Yeah, nepotism again.
Also, what we do is one episode we have guests like you, and then the next episode we call that a metasode because we're very meta over here. We're not affiliated with Meta again. We talk about these kind of things that came up in the episode. So yeah, next week our listeners will listen to more about this story, I think.
Yeah, we'll talk about you next week.
Yeah.
Great things, I'm sure.
How annoying were these guys?
Yeah, but we're always very positive about all of our guests because we want people to come to us, right? So we can just trash our guests. Yeah, but also we are not the kind of people.
Okay, so just before we close, if you can share, how many listeners do you get? Do you do anything to market the podcast?
We don't do anything special to market the podcast except for post it on Twitter and LinkedIn. And any listeners that we've gotten have mostly been like through people we know or people who discovered the podcast themselves. In terms of numbers, the numbers I remember right now is like we have about 20,000 total downloads. We get the maximum downloads we've had is 3,500 on an episode. I think we have 18 episodes now. That number might be a little off. On average, it comes down to about 1,000 downloads per episode.
Cool.
Nice. Those are great stats. We are at time, so just quickly, where can people find you? What's your favorite podcast before you say bye-bye?
People can find me on LinkedIn, Ronak Nathani, or Twitter, same, Ronak Nathani. I have my website, ronaknathani.com, and that'll point you to every other link, as well as the podcast, softwaremisadventures.com. Favorite podcast? I love many of them, but if I had to pick one, I would say the Tim Ferriss Show.
Very cool. I'm like looking up my LinkedIn handle right now. Sorry. My favorite podcast, Indie Hackers. Pretty easy choice on that one. I love their format now. But anyways, and then my LinkedIn is at GYANG8. Too many Chinese people with the same names. Yeah, it's a problem.
All right. I got to drop off, folks, but thank you so much for having us. This was a blast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
It was awesome. Thanks for coming. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for listening. And please send us a note if you have any questions. Or if you enjoyed the podcast, if you listened up to this point, send us a note. We want to see actually who is listening, because all we see right now is just raw numbers. We really want to meet our audience, all our listeners. We really want to understand who are the people behind the numbers. Yeah, and also if you haven't already, give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to the podcast. And see you next week. Postscriptum. We have a newsletter on Substack. So it is at newsletter.metacastpodcast.com. It's also linked in the show notes. Please subscribe if you haven't already. If you're a podcaster, I think you'll find a lot of valuable info there, because every time we have an episode coming out, we summarize all of the takeaways and links and all the useful things that guests said. So even if actually you don't even listen to the podcast, but you read the newsletter, you will get something out of it if you do podcasting. But obviously, they go very well together as a bundle.
And yeah, if you like it, please share it with your friends and networks.
Yeah, we feel like our growth is kind of stuck, right? So we need people to share more. So please share our podcast with people who might be interested in this, or just share it in your LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Mastodon, Google Plus.
Yeah.
No, wait, Google Plus doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
All right. Bye for now.
Cool.